the ancient kingdom of Valdoria, where royal blood was said to carry both blessing and curse, there existed a tradition so sacred that breaking it meant death. Every newborn of noble birth spent their first 100 days in the grand nursery, protected by walls that had witnessed 5 centuries of secrets. But on the night when thunder split the sky and the moon hid behind crimson clouds, something happened that would shake the very foundations of the realm. The royal guard had received orders that chilled their battle-hardened souls. Clear the nursery immediately. Every child, every caretaker, everyone was to be removed before midnight struck. No questions asked. No explanations given. Just swift, silent evacuation. As the last footstep echoed down the marble corridors, and the great doors sealed shut with a sound like a tomb closing, the nursery stood empty for the first time in 500 years. The silence was absolute. The darkness complete, or so they thought. For in the corner where shadows gathered thickest, something moved. Something that should not have been there. Something that would change everything. Captain Marcus Thorne had served the crown for 23 years, but never had he received an order that made his hands shake like they did now. The parchment bore the royal seal pressed so hard into the wax that tiny cracks spiderwebbed around its edges. The message was brief, written in the king's own hand. Clear the grand nursery. All souls. Before midnight. Tell no one why. The grand nursery stood at the heart of Valdoria's royal palace, its walls built from stones that had witnessed the birth of every heir to the throne for 5 centuries. Tonight, those walls seemed to pulse with an energy that made Marcus's teeth ache. The autumn wind howled through the palace corridors, carrying with it whispers that spoke of things better left forgotten. Marcus gathered his most trusted guards in the armory, their faces lit by flickering torchlight. These were men who had bled for the kingdom, who had stood against enemies both foreign and domestic. Yet as he read the orders aloud, he watched their faces pale. "Sir," ventured Lieutenant Garrett, a man whose courage had never been questioned. "What threat could possibly—" "We don't ask questions tonight." Marcus cut him off, though his own mind raced with the same thoughts. "We follow orders. The nursery must be empty before the cathedral bells ring midnight. That gives us 3 hours." The nursery housed 47 children that night, ranging from newborns still red and wrinkled from birth, to toddlers taking their first wobbling steps. They came from the kingdom's most powerful families, dukes and duchesses, lords and ladies, even distant cousins of the royal line. Their parents had entrusted them to the palace's care, as tradition demanded, believing them safer within these ancient walls than in their own estates. Lady Catherine Whitmore, the head nursemaid, met them at the nursery's great oak doors. Her silver hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her steel-gray eyes had seen 30 years of royal children pass through these halls. She was not a woman easily rattled, but tonight her hands trembled as she clutched her ring of keys. "Captain," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "surely there's been some mistake. The children are settled for the night. Some are ill with fever, moving them in this weather." "Lady Catherine," Marcus interrupted gently, for he held great respect for the woman who had practically raised half the nobility. "The orders come directly from His Majesty. We must move quickly and quietly. Where can we relocate them?" Her weathered face crumpled with worry. "The East Wing has been prepared for renovations. It's barely suitable and certainly not safe for infants." "Captain, what danger threatens them here that could possibly be worse than exposure to cold and dampness?" Marcus had no answer. The king's message had contained no explanation, no hint of the threat they faced. For all his years of service, he had learned to trust his sovereign's judgment, even when that judgment seemed to make no sense. The evacuation began in the stillness before the storm truly broke. Guards moved through the nursery like ghosts, their boots wrapped in cloth to muffle their steps. They worked by candlelight, afraid that torches might wake the children too suddenly. Each sleeping child was lifted carefully, wrapped in whatever blankets could be found, and carried through corridors that seemed to stretch longer than usual. Her nurse, a young woman named Sarah, whispered soothing words as they hurried through passages that had never seemed so cold, so threatening. The stone walls seemed to lean inward, as if the palace itself opposed their mission. Thomas Ashford, son of the Duke of Westmarch, stirred, as he was moved, but did not wake. At 8 months, he was just beginning to sit upright on his own. His chubby fingers clutched a wooden rattle that had belonged to 3 generations of his family. As his guard carried him through the great hall, the rattle slipped from his grasp and clattered to the floor, the sound echoing like a scream in the silence. The older children proved more challenging. 3-year-old Lady Miranda Blackstone, daughter of the realm's most powerful duchess, woke completely as she was lifted from her small bed. Her dark eyes, so like her mother's, filled with tears as she reached for Lady Catherine. "I want Mama," she whispered, her voice carrying a heartbreak that made grown warriors look away. "Mama will come for you soon, little dove," Lady Catherine lied. Because sometimes lies were kinder than truth, and truth was something none of them possessed that night. As the evacuation continued, strange things began to happen. Candles flickered without any wind to disturb them. Shadows moved independently of the bodies that should have cast them. Several guards reported hearing whispers in languages they didn't recognize, coming from empty rooms. Lieutenant Garrett was carrying twin boys from the Northumberland family when he saw it first, a figure standing at the far end of the corridor, watching their procession. The figure was tall and draped in darkness, its face hidden beneath a hood that seemed to absorb the candlelight around it. "Captain," Garrett called softly. But when Marcus looked, the corridor was empty. "Keep moving," Marcus ordered, but his sword hand moved instinctively to his weapon's hilt. The nursery that had been filled with soft breathing, gentle snores, and the occasional cry of a restless child grew quieter with each removal. The silence that remained was not peaceful. It was waiting, hungry, expectant. Even the mice that usually scurried through the walls had gone quiet, as if they too sensed something approaching. Lady Catherine was among the last to leave. She walked through each room one final time, checking corners and shadows, making sure no child had been overlooked. The nursery had been her world for 3 decades, and leaving it felt like abandoning a piece of her soul. In the Rose Room, where the youngest infant slept, she paused beside an empty cradle and whispered a prayer to whatever gods might still be listening. As she turned to leave, her candle flame danced wildly, and for just a moment she could have sworn she heard the sound of a baby crying. But the rooms were empty. They had checked and double-checked. Every child was accounted for. Marcus stood in the doorway as Lady Catherine emerged, her face pale but determined. Behind her, the nursery stretched into darkness, its familiar warmth already fading into something colder. "Is that everyone?" he asked, though he knew she would have died before leaving a child behind. "Everyone," she confirmed, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty that made his chest tighten. "They sealed the great oak doors with chains and locks, as if they could contain whatever had prompted the evacuation." The iron felt cold beneath Marcus's hands, colder than winter metal had any right to be. As the last lock clicked into place, he heard it, a sound so faint he might have imagined it, a baby's cry, coming from inside the sealed nursery. "Did you hear?" Lady Catherine began. "No," Marcus said quickly, too quickly. "I heard nothing, and neither did you." But they both had, and the sound would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The evacuation was complete with 20 minutes to spare before midnight. 47 children now huddled in the cold, unsuitable chambers of the East Wing, tended by nursemaids who whispered prayers and tried not to show their fear. The palace felt different with the nursery empty, hollow, like a body with its heart removed. As the cathedral bells began to toll the midnight hour, Captain Marcus Thorne stood guard outside the sealed nursery doors. Each chime seemed to vibrate through the stones beneath his feet, and with each toll, the darkness inside the nursery seemed to grow deeper, more alive. 12 chimes marked the beginning of something new and terrible. And in the absolute silence that followed, from somewhere deep within the sealed nursery, came the sound of footsteps. Small footsteps. Child-sized footsteps. But every child was gone. Marcus had counted them himself. Every child was gone. The footsteps continued for 7 minutes after midnight, each small step echoing through the sealed nursery like a heartbeat in a tomb. Captain Marcus pressed his ear against the cold oak doors, his breath forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The sound was impossible. They had counted every child, checked every corner, searched every shadow. Yet inside the sealed chamber, something walked. When the footsteps finally stopped, the silence that followed was worse than any sound. It pressed against the doors like a living thing, patient and hungry. Marcus stationed 2 guards at the entrance and went to find answers, though he feared what those answers might reveal. King Aldrich stood in his private study, surrounded by books so old their pages crumbled at a touch. The fire in the hearth burned blue instead of orange, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently across the stone walls. When Marcus entered, the king didn't look up from the ancient tome spread before him, its pages covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. "The nursery is empty, Your Majesty," Marcus reported, though his voice carried the weight of unasked questions. "Is it?" the king replied, still not lifting his eyes from the book. His fingers, pale and trembling, traced symbols that seemed to shift and writhe under his touch. "Are you certain every soul has been removed?" The question sent ice through Marcus's veins. Every child, every nursemaid, every attendant. I counted them myself, sire. 47 children, all relocated to the East Wing. King Aldrich finally looked up and Marcus stepped back involuntarily. The king's eyes, once a warm brown, now held flecks of silver that moved like mercury. Lines had appeared on his face that hadn't been there that morning, and his hair had gained streaks of white that aged him decades. Tell me about the Blackthorn child, the king said quietly. Marcus frowned. Blackthorn, your majesty? There is no family by that name among the nobles. No child in the nursery bears. Think carefully, Captain. The king's voice carried a warning that made Marcus's sword hand twitch. A child found at the palace gates 3 months ago. No family, no history, no name. Taken in by Lady Catherine's compassion, dark hair, pale skin, eyes like winter storms. The memory hit Marcus like a physical blow. How had he forgotten? A foundling brought to the palace on a night much like this. One, when thunder split the sky and rain fell like tears from heaven. Lady Catherine had found the child herself, wrapped in cloth that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. No one had claimed the child. No family had come forward. The babe had simply become another ward of the crown. Lydia, Marcus whispered, the name coming to him as if from a great distance. She called the child Lydia. And where is Lydia now, Captain? Marcus's blood turned to ice water in his veins. In all the chaos of the evacuation, in all the counting and recounting, he had not seen the foundling child. Not once. The realization struck him like lightning. In his mental count of 47 children, he had forgotten the one who had no noble bloodline, no powerful family to notice her absence. She should have been moved with the others, Marcus said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were wrong. The guards had been told to evacuate all children, but in the darkness and confusion, had anyone specifically looked for the quiet, pale child who kept to the shadows? King Aldrich closed the ancient book with a sound like breaking bones. Captain, I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. 3 months ago, something came to our gates dressed as an abandoned child. We took it in, as compassion demanded. But compassion can be a weakness when dealing with things that should not exist in our world. The king stood and walked to a window that looked out over the kingdom. Lightning illuminated his profile, revealing features that seemed older than his years, worn by knowledge that no mortal was meant to carry. The royal bloodline carries certain sensitivities, Captain. We see things others cannot, feel presences that others miss. From the moment that child entered the nursery, I felt it, a coldness that had nothing to do with winter, a hunger that no amount of milk could satisfy. But I thought, hoped, that perhaps love and care might transform whatever it was into something human.
Marcus waited, afraid to speak, afraid to break the spell of revelation that hung between them.
I was wrong, the king continued. 3 days ago, I received a vision in my dreams. I saw the nursery filled with shadows, heard the screams of children being drained of something precious. Not their lives, Captain, but something deeper. Their souls, their very essence, consumed by a thing wearing the face of innocence. The room seemed to grow colder with each word. Outside, the storm intensified, rain lashing against the windows like fingers trying to claw their way inside. The child, Lydia, she's still in the nursery, Marcus said, understanding finally dawning. And now that she's alone, now that all the other children have been removed from her reach, she can finally show her true nature without witnesses to complicate matters. As if summoned by their conversation, a sound drifted through the palace walls. It was singing, a child's voice raised in a lullaby that no human throat should be able to produce. The melody was beautiful and terrible, familiar yet wrong, like a song remembered from a nightmare. The king's face went ashen. It's beginning. They returned to the nursery together, accompanied by 6 of the kingdom's finest guards and Lady Catherine, who had refused to be left behind despite the danger. The corridor leading to the nursery had grown longer, or perhaps their steps had grown shorter, weighted down by dread. The singing continued, echoing off stone walls that seemed to pulse with each note. At the sealed doors they paused. The chains and locks remained intact, showing no signs of tampering, yet the singing was clearly coming from within. Lady Catherine pressed her hands against the wood, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. I raised that child, she whispered. I fed her, bathed her, sang her to sleep. She was so quiet, so well-behaved. How could I not have seen? Because she wanted you to see only what would keep you from asking questions. The king replied gently. Such creatures are masters of deception, showing us exactly what we expect to see. The singing stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so complete that they could hear their own heartbeats. Then, from inside the nursery, came a sound that made them all step back, the scraping of small fingernails against wood, as if something was clawing at the doors from the inside. "Let me out," came a voice, sweet and innocent, and wrong in ways that made their souls recoil. It was Lydia's voice, but changed, older somehow, carrying harmonics that spoke of vast emptiness and endless hunger. "Please, I'm scared. It's so dark in here." Lady Catherine took a step toward the door before King Aldrich caught her arm. "That's not the child you raised," he said firmly. "That's not even truly a child at all." The voice changed, becoming multiple voices speaking in unison. Some young, some old, some human, others decidedly not. "We know you're there, mortals. We can smell your fear, taste your doubt. You cannot keep us contained forever." "What is it?" Marcus asked, his hand tight on his sword hilt, though he knew steel would be useless against whatever lurked beyond the door. "A shadow child," the king replied, his voice heavy with ancient knowledge. "Born from the spaces between worlds, fed by innocence and nurtured by trust, they appear as foundlings, as lost children in need of care, and they infiltrate places of safety to feed on those who show them kindness." The scratching at the door intensified, joined by what sounded like multiple sets of claws, as if dozens of creatures were trying to break through the wood. Yet they had only left one child inside. "How many are there now?" Lady Catherine whispered. The king's face was grave. "Shadow children multiply when they feed. Each soul they consume becomes part of their collective, adding to their power and number." If she had remained with the other children. "Bad place is dead." With this sentence, he didn't need to. The scraping stopped again, replaced by laughter, the sound of children at play, innocent and joyful, and absolutely terrifying in the context of their situation. It was as if a playground full of children had suddenly materialized inside the sealed nursery, their voices echoing and overlapping in impossible ways. "We remember you, Lady Catherine." The voices sang in harmony. "Sweet Catherine who brought us warm milk and soft songs. Would you like to hear the songs we've learned in return? Songs from the spaces between stars? Melodies that predate your world?" Despite the king's warning grip on her arm, Lady Catherine found herself drawn toward the door. The voices were so familiar, so much like the children she had cared for over the decades. Even changed as they were, she could hear echoes of lullabies she had sung, games she had taught, comfort she had offered in times of fear. "I need to see," she whispered, reaching for the locks with trembling fingers. "If there's any chance that she's still the child I raised." "Catherine, no," King Aldrich commanded, but his voice seemed to come from very far away. The lock clicked open under her touch, though she had no memory of finding the right key. The chain fell away with a sound like breaking glass. The door, solid oak reinforced with iron bands, swung open as if pushed by invisible hands. Darkness poured out of the nursery like a living thing, bringing with it the scent of old graves and forgotten nightmares. In that darkness, shapes moved, small figures that might once have been children, their faces pale and their eyes reflecting light like those of nocturnal predators. At the center of them all stood Lydia, unchanged from the quiet foundling Lady Catherine remembered, yet transformed into something that made the mind rebel against recognition. She smiled with teeth too white and too sharp, and her winter storm eyes held depths that spoke of eons rather than months. "Thank you for opening the door, dear Catherine," she said in her sweet, innocent voice. "We've been so very hungry, and there are still 47 children in the East Wing who need our special kind of care." The shadow children began to pour out of the nursery like smoke given form, their movements fluid and wrong, as if they remembered how to walk but had forgotten what it meant to be bound by flesh and bone. King Aldrich raised his hand, speaking words in a language that predated human civilization, and golden light blazed between them and the emerging creatures. The shadow children hissed and drew back, but they did not flee. Instead, they began to circle, looking for weaknesses in the king's hastily erected barrier. "This will not hold them long," he said through gritted teeth, sweat beading on his forehead from the effort of maintaining the ward. "We need to reach the other children before they do." But even as he spoke, they could hear it beginning. The sound of children crying out in the distance, voices raised in fear and confusion as shadows crept into their temporary sanctuary. The shadow children had found another way, slipping through passages that existed only in nightmare, moving faster than running feet could carry them. The evacuation had been for nothing. The real hunt was just beginning. The screams from the east wing cut through the palace like knives through silk, each cry a testament to the horror that Marcus and his men had been too late to prevent. The shadow children had found their way to the relocated nursery through pathways that existed only in the spaces between heartbeats, in the corners where candlelight couldn't reach, in the breath between words of half-remembered prayers. King Aldrich's golden barrier flickered like a candle in a hurricane as more shadow children emerged from the nursery. What had begun as one foundling had become dozens, each one a reflection of innocence corrupted, childhood transformed into something that hungered for the very essence of life itself. Lydia stood at the center of the growing swarm, her pale face serene as she watched the king struggle to maintain his protected ward. She had grown since emerging from the nursery, not physically, but in presence, in the weight of darkness that surrounded her like a cloak. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of something far older than the palace walls. "Your magic is strong, king of men," she said, tilting her head with the curiosity of a cat watching a mouse. "But it feeds on hope, on the belief that light can triumph over darkness. Tell me, what hope do you hold now that you hear the children crying?" The sound of battle erupted from the direction of the east wing, steel clashing against something that rang like crystal when struck, men shouting orders that dissolved into screams. Marcus could hear Lieutenant Garrett's voice among them, roaring commands to guards who were facing an enemy they had never been trained to fight. "We have to help them," Marcus said, his sword already in his hand despite knowing its uselessness against creatures made of shadow and malice. "If we leave this position, nothing will stop her from reaching the heart of the palace," King Aldrich replied through gritted teeth. Sweat poured down his face as he poured more power into the barrier. "The royal chambers, the throne room, the sacred artifacts that have protected this kingdom for 500 years. All of it will fall to corruption." Lady Catherine stood frozen between the two choices, her heart torn between the children she had raised and the kingdom she had served. In her weathered hands, she clutched a small silver locket, a gift from the first royal child she had cared for, decades ago. Inside was a lock of hair from every child who had passed through the nursery under her care, a collection of memories that represented her life's work. "There has to be another way," she whispered. But even as she spoke, she knew the truth that lived in the shadows of fairy tales and ancient warnings. Some choices could not be avoided, and some prices had to be paid in full. Lydia's laugh was like winter bells chiming in an empty cathedral. "Oh, but there is another way, dear Catherine. There is always another way, if one is willing to pay the proper price." The shadow children parted like a dark sea, creating a path that led directly to Lydia. The foundling, the creature wearing the face of the child Lady Catherine had loved, extended one pale hand in invitation. "You raised me, fed me, sang to me when nightmares came," Lydia said, her voice carrying echoes of every lullaby Lady Catherine had ever sung. "You showed me what love looked like, what sacrifice meant, what it was to care more for another's well-being than for your own. Such beautiful lessons, Catherine. Such pure emotions to feed upon." The golden barrier flickered again, and King Aldrich stumbled. The strain of maintaining the ward against so many shadow children was draining his strength faster than he had anticipated. Blood trickled from his nose, and his silver-flecked eyes began to dim. "I can save them all," Lydia continued, her child's voice carrying impossible weight. "Every crying child in the East Wing, every guard bleeding in the corridors, every soul in this palace can be spared. All you have to do is come to me willingly, Catherine. Give me what I truly hunger for. Not your life, but your love. Not your body, but your soul. Feed me the pure essence of everything you are, everything you've ever cared for, and I will take my children and leave this place forever." Marcus turned to look at Lady Catherine, seeing in her weathered face a terrible understanding. She knew what Lydia was offering, and more importantly, she knew it was real. Shadow children were bound by their own rules, their own twisted honor. If she accepted the bargain, it would be kept. "Catherine, no," Marcus said, reading the decision in her eyes. "There has to be another way." "What other way?" she replied, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "How many children die while we search for alternatives that don't exist? How many guards fall while we cling to hope that has no foundation?" From the East Wing came a sound that decided everything. Baby Eleanor Ravencrest's cry, high and terrified and heartbreakingly human. The 3-week-old infant was calling for comfort that would never come, protection that had already failed, love that was being consumed by creatures that understood kindness only as weakness to be exploited. Lady Catherine made her choice. She stepped forward, crossing the threshold of King Aldrich's barrier before anyone could stop her. The golden light parted around her like water, recognizing her decision and honoring her sacrifice, even as it grieved for what was about to be lost. "I accept," she said simply, facing Lydia with the same courage she had shown every night for 30 years when comforting frightened children. "Take what you need from me, but spare them. All of them. That's the bargain." Lydia's smile was radiant and terrible, innocent and ancient, beautiful and absolutely wrong. "Oh, sweet Catherine, you still don't understand what you're offering, do you?" The shadow children began to sing, a lullaby that Lady Catherine recognized, one she had hummed countless times while rocking babies to sleep. But their voices twisted the familiar melody into something that spoke of endings rather than comfort, of sleep that lasted forever rather than peaceful rest. "When I take your essence, your love, your very soul," Lydia explained with the patience of a teacher instructing a beloved student, "I don't just gain power. I gain memory. I gain experience. I gain every moment of joy you've ever felt caring for a child, every surge of protective instinct, every prayer you've whispered over a sickbed. I become you, Catherine, but perfected, purified, made eternal." Lady Catherine's face went pale as understanding dawned. "You're not just feeding on love. You're stealing it, taking it away from the world forever." "Not taking," Lydia corrected gently, "preserving. Your love for these children will live forever inside me, unchanged by time or death, or the thousand small betrayals that mortal love endures." Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that what every mother dreams of? Love that never fades, never disappoints, never ends. Behind them, the golden light exploded outward in a shower of sparks before dissolving into nothing, leaving them exposed and defenseless. The king collapsed to one knee, his strength finally exhausted, his face gray with the effort of maintaining the ward for so long. The shadow children flowed forward like a tide of darkness, but they stopped just short of touching Lady Catherine. They formed a circle around her and Lydia, their pale faces turned upward in expectation, waiting for the feast that had been promised. "It's too late to change your mind," Lydia said, extending both hands toward Lady Catherine. "The bargain has been made, the price agreed upon. Will you honor it willingly, or shall I take what you've offered by force?" Lady Catherine looked back one last time at King Aldrich and Captain Marcus, seeing in their faces the same helpless love she had felt watching children grow up and leave her care. Some forms of sacrifice were their own reward, and some choices made themselves. "I've spent 30 years learning how to love," she said quietly. "If that love can save them, then it was never mine to begin with." It was always meant for this moment. She took Lydia's hands. The world exploded into silver light and absolute darkness simultaneously, as if day and night had tried to occupy the same space and time. Lady Catherine's scream was joy and agony intertwined, the sound of a soul being torn from its mortal home and fed to something that had never learned the difference between love and hunger. The light lasted only seconds, but in those seconds, Marcus saw everything. He saw Lady Catherine's memories flowing into Lydia like water into a cup. Every child she had ever cared for, every scraped knee she had kissed, every fever she had nursed, every nightmare she had chased away. He saw the shadow children writhing and changing as they absorbed pieces of that pure love, their forms becoming more solid, more real, more human. And he saw Lydia transform. The pale, quiet foundling vanished, replaced by something that wore Lady Catherine's face, but carried depths of experience no mortal woman could possess. She stood taller, moved with purpose instead of childish uncertainty. And when she looked at them, her eyes held 30 years of gathered love twisted into something that served darkness instead of light. The screaming from the east wing stopped. The sounds of battle faded into silence. The palace itself seemed to exhale, as if some great tension had finally been released. "The bargain is complete," the thing wearing Lady Catherine's face said, and her voice was exactly as it had always been. Warm, caring, infinitely gentle. "Your children are safe, your kingdom is preserved, your people will live to see another dawn. I have what I came for." The shadow children began to fade, their forms becoming translucent as they prepared to return to whatever space between worlds had spawned them. But they moved differently now, less like predators and more like children being called home to supper. "Where will you go?" King Aldrich asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. The creature smiled with Lady Catherine's mouth, but the expression held depths of knowledge that spoke of eons rather than years. "Wherever love is needed but has been forgotten," wherever children cry in the dark with no one to comfort them. This is the book. It's about history, wherever love is needed but has been forgotten, wherever children cry in the dark with no one to comfort them. We are not evil, King of Men. We are simply thorough in our methods. And Lady Catherine lives forever in the love she gave so freely. She wanted to save your children, and she has. She wanted to matter, to make a difference, to love purely without reservation or condition. Now she can do so for eternity, caring for the lost and abandoned across all worlds and times. It should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like the worst kind of damnation. The creature that had been Lydia, that now carried Lady Catherine's essence, walked to where Marcus stood. She reached up and touched his face with fingers that felt exactly like the woman who had been his friend, his colleague, his constant source of wisdom and stability. "Take care of them, Marcus," she said in Lady Catherine's voice. "Love them as I taught you to love them. Guard them as I showed you to guard them. And remember, sometimes the greatest sacrifice is not dying for those you love, but living forever to serve them." She turned to go, but paused at the threshold of the nursery doors. "Oh, and Marcus, when you tell this story, and you will tell it because stories are how love survives when people cannot. Remember that every choice has a price." Lady Catherine chose to pay that price willingly, and her love will echo through eternity as a result. The shadow children filed past her into the nursery, no longer the hungry predators they had been, but something closer to students following a beloved teacher. As the last one crossed the threshold, the door swung shut with a sound like finality itself. When Marcus and King Aldrich checked the locks moments later, they found chains that had rusted through, metal that crumbled at their touch. The nursery beyond was not empty, it was simply elsewhere, existing in a space that connected to their world only when needed. The children in the East Wing were found sleeping peacefully, with no memory of the terror that had stalked them. Baby Eleanor woke to nurse normally. Thomas Ashford played with his rattle as if nothing had happened, and little Lady Miranda asked only when she might return to her regular room. The guards who had fought the shadow children remembered only darkness and confusion, a battle against enemies they couldn't quite recall. Their wounds healed cleanly, and their dreams remained untroubled by memories too terrible for mortal minds to process. But Captain Marcus remembered everything, as did King Aldrich. They carried the story between them like a shared burden, speaking of it only when the moon was dark and the wind carried whispers that reminded them of children singing lullabies in languages that predated human speech. And sometimes, on nights when the autumn wind howled through the palace corridors and shadows moved independently of the bodies that cast them, they would hear it, the sound of Lady Catherine's voice, warm and gentle and infinitely loving, singing lullabies to children who existed in the spaces between worlds. She had kept her bargain, the shadow children had kept theirs, and in the grand nursery, behind doors that opened only when needed, love lived on in forms that no mortal heart could fully comprehend, but every parent's soul could recognize. The nursery was never used again, but it was never truly empty, because love, once given freely, echoes across eternity. Whether in service to light or shadow, whether as salvation or sacrifice, whether as blessing or curse. And Lady Catherine's love, purified by willing sacrifice and made eternal by forces beyond human understanding, would continue to care for lost children until the stars themselves forgot how to shine.